I've always thought of myself as a man who notices things. The way the wind shifts through the oak trees lining our cul-de-sac, the faint hum of the refrigerator at night, the way Sarah's laugh used to ripple through our house like a melody I couldn't get out of my head. 20 years of marriage does that to you. Sharpens your senses, tunes you into the rhythm of your life with someone. So when that rhythm faltered, I felt it before I understood it. It started with small things. Sarah's keys weren't on the hook by the garage door one evening. She said she'd left them in her coat pocket after a late-night grocery run. But the fridge was as empty as it had been that morning. Then there were the phone calls she'd take in the backyard. Her voice low and hurried. The kind of tone you don't use with a friend catching up or a coworker sorting out schedules. We live in a tidy little house in Willow Creek, a neighborhood where everyone waves and the biggest scandal is someone forgetting to mow their lawn. I'm Mark, a high school history teacher, the guy who spends weekends grading papers and fixing the leaky faucet Sarah's been nagging me about for months. She's a paralegal, sharp as a tack, with a smile that could charm a stone into blushing. We've built something good here. 2 kids off at college, a mortgage nearly paid, a life that felt like it was coasting toward a quiet, comfortable finish. But lately, that comfort had started to fray. The real clue came on a Tuesday in October. I'd come home early. Parent-teacher conferences wrapped up sooner than expected, and found the house empty. Sarah's car wasn't in the driveway, which wasn't odd. She sometimes stayed late at the office. But there was a smell in the air, faint but distinct, like old wood and something chemical I couldn't place. It lingered in the hallway, trailing toward the basement door. We rarely went down there anymore. It was my old workshop, a relic from the days I'd tinker with furniture or fiddle with broken clocks. Now it was just storage, boxes of Christmas decorations, the kids' old toys, and a few dusty shelves I'd built when we first moved in. I flicked on the light and descended the creaky stairs, the smell growing stronger. At the bottom, I froze. The workbench I'd abandoned years ago was cleared off, polished even, and covered with tools I didn't recognize. Tiny scalpels, jars of some murky liquid, and what looked like feathers scattered across the surface. In the corner, draped under a tarp, was something I couldn't make sense of at first. I pulled the fabric back and stared at a taxidermied fox, its glass eyes glinting in the dim light, its fur meticulously groomed. I hadn't touched taxidermy since I was a kid, and Sarah had always found it creepy. So why was this here? My stomach twisted, not from fear, but from a gnawing suspicion I couldn't yet name. I didn't confront her that night. She came home an hour later, her cheeks flushed, claiming she'd been at a client meeting. I nodded, poured her a glass of wine, and watched her sip it while that chemical scent clung to my memory. Something was off, and I wasn't the type to let it slide. I'd spent my life piecing together stories from the past. Dates, battles, betrayals. If there was a puzzle here, I'd figure it out. I just didn't know yet how deep it ran, or how much it would unravel everything I thought I knew about us. The next few days, I turned into a shadow of myself, a man obsessed with corners and silences. I didn't ask Sarah about the fox or the basement. Instead, I watched. She'd always been a creature of habit. Coffee at 7, yoga on Wednesdays, a glass of Pinot Grigio before bed. But now her routines were slipping. She'd leave the house with vague excuses, errands, a friend in need, and come back with that same flushed look, her eyes darting away from mine. I started checking things. Her coat pockets had a receipt from a hardware store I'd never heard of, 30 miles out of town, for wire and glue. Her phone, left on the counter one morning, buzzed with a text from T. Meet me at the usual 6. She'd never mentioned a T before. T could have been anyone, but my mind went straight to Tom. Tom Grayson, my oldest friend, the guy I'd known since we were 10, racing bikes down dirt trails and sneaking into abandoned barns. He'd moved back to Willow Creek a year ago after his divorce, bought a fixer-upper 2 streets over. We'd reconnected over beers, swapped stories about the old days. He'd even come by the house a few times, always with a grin and a bottle of something decent. Sarah liked him, said he had a vintage charm. Whatever that meant, I'd laughed it off. Now it didn't seem so funny. Tom had always been odd in a way I'd found endearing. Back in high school, while I was memorizing Civil War generals, He was stuffing squirrels in his dad's garage, a hobby he picked up from some taxidermy book he'd found at a flea market. He'd drag me along sometimes, showing off his latest project. A bird with wings spread, a raccoon posed mid-snarl. I'd lost interest by college, but he'd kept at it, even made a little side gig out of it after his tech job went south. Could that fox in the basement be his work? The thought gnawed at me, a thread I couldn't stop pulling. I decided to test it. Friday night, I invited Tom over for dinner. Sarah hesitated when I mentioned it, her fingers tightening around her fork, but she didn't object. He showed up at 6 sharp, his lanky frame filling the doorway, that familiar grin plastered on his face. "Mark, you old dog, still keeping this place together?" he said, clapping me on the shoulder. Sarah smiled too, but it didn't reach her eyes. We ate roast chicken and mashed potatoes, the conversation light school, his house renovations, the weather. I waited until dessert to drop it. "Found something weird in the basement," I said casually, spooning apple crisp onto my plate. "A taxidermied fox. You still into that stuff, Tom?" His fork paused halfway to his mouth, just for a second before he laughed. "Me? Nah, man, I gave that up years ago. Too much hassle." Sarah coughed into her napkin, excused herself to get water. I watched them both, the air thick with something I couldn't name yet. Tom's laugh was too loud, Sarah's absence too long. When she came back, her hands were trembling slightly, and I knew I was onto something. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay there, Sarah's breathing soft beside me, and replayed every glance, every word. The fox wasn't a coincidence. The tools, the smell, Tom's flinch, it was a map, and I was starting to see the territory. I didn't have proof yet, but I had enough to start digging. I'd always been patient, methodical. History taught me that truth doesn't hide forever. It just waits for someone stubborn enough to find it. And I was stubborn as hell. By Monday, I was a man possessed. I called in sick to school, first time in years, and turned our house into my own private investigation. Sarah left for work at 8, her goodbye kiss quick and distracted. The second her car pulled out, I went back to the basement. The fox was still there, its glass eyes mocking me. I tore through the space, methodical but frantic, lifting boxes, checking shelves. Under a stack of old blankets, I found a wooden crate, unmarked, its lid loose. Inside were more tools, pliers, a small saw, a jar of amber liquid labeled preservative, and a notebook. Sarah's handwriting filled the pages, neat and precise. Dates, times, notes like, "T brought the owl today," and "need more thread for the stitching." My chest tightened. T was Tom, no doubt now. The dates matched her late nights, her client meetings. But why? What were they doing down here? I flipped further and found sketches. Birds, a deer head, a raccoon, each with annotations about fur texture and eye placement. It wasn't just a hobby. It was an obsession, something they shared in secret. I sat there, the notebook trembling in my hands, and felt the life I'd built with her crack open like a fault line. I needed more. I drove to Tom's place, a ramshackle 2-story with peeling paint and a sagging porch. His truck was gone, so I parked a block away and walked back, keeping to the shadows. The garage door was unlocked, careless Tom, and inside, I hit the jackpot. A workbench like mine, cluttered with taxidermy supplies and half-finished projects. A hawk, wings pinned, a rabbit in mid-mount. On a shelf, I found photos, Tom and Sarah smiling, holding up a stuffed pheasant like it was a trophy. Another of them laughing, her hand on his arm. His eyes on her in a way that made my stomach churn. They weren't just working together. This was intimacy, a bond one hadn't seen coming. I took the photos, slipped them into my jacket, and drove home, my mind racing. She'd betrayed me. Not just with him, but with this weird, private world they'd built behind my back. Taxidermy wasn't my thing anymore, but it had been ours, mine and Tom's. A piece of my past he'd stolen and twisted with her. The cruelty of it sank in slowly, a cold weight in my gut. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at those photos and started planning. Revenge wasn't a word I'd ever lived by. I was the guy who let slights roll off, who forgave the kids who cheated on tests because I figured life would sort them out. But this was different. Sarah and Tom hadn't just broken trust. They'd mocked it, turned something innocent into their little game. I'd make them pay, not with fists or shouting, but with something sharper, something they'd never see coming. I thought about the fox, its lifeless stare, and an idea began to form, cruel, precise, perfect. I'd use what they loved against them, turn their obsession into their undoing. History's full of lessons about betrayal, and I'd always been a good teacher. The days after finding those photos, I moved like a ghost through my own life. Sarah didn't notice. She was too caught up in her excuses, her late nights, her quick smiles that didn't match the tension in her shoulders. I'd nod, grade papers, fix dinner, all while the gears in my head turned. I wasn't rash, never had been. A good plan takes time, and I had plenty of it. The basement became my sanctuary, that fox my silent confidant. I'd sit there, staring at it, letting the pieces fall into place. They loved their taxidermy, their little secret world of preserved things. I'd give them something preserved too, something they'd never forget. First, I needed to know more. I started tailing Sarah. It wasn't hard. She'd gotten sloppy, trusting I'd never suspect. Tuesday night, she said she was meeting a coworker for drinks. I waited 10 minutes after she left, then followed, keeping my headlights off until I hit the main road. Her car turned toward Tom Street, not the bar she'd named. I parked a block away and watched her slip into his garage, the light flickering on through the grimy windows. I didn't go closer, not yet. I just sat there, the engine ticking as it cooled, and let the truth settle in. They weren't just dabbling. This was regular, deliberate. Back home, I dug deeper. Tom's house wasn't the only place they met. The notebook had mentions of the shed, a storage unit. I figured somewhere they could work without prying eyes. I found a key in Sarah's purse one morning while she showered, tucked into a side pocket with a tag, Unit 17. A quick search online showed a storage place off Route 12, 20 minutes out of town. I went that afternoon, the key biting into my palm. Unit 17 was a treasure trove. More animals. Birds, a small deer, even a bobcat. Half finished or fully mounted, tools everywhere, and a corkboard with Polaroids of them laughing, posing with their creations. One shot showed Sarah brushing preservative on a squirrel while Tom watched, his hand resting on her back. I took that photo too, slipped it into my growing collection. The shed told me something else. They were proud of this. It wasn't just a fling. It was a partnership, a twisted passion they'd nurtured behind my back. That's when the plan crystallized. I'd let them keep their little game, but I'd turn it into a cage. I spent the next few nights researching taxidermy techniques, chemicals, suppliers. I ordered what I needed online using a prepaid card Sarah didn't know about, shipped to a P.O. box I'd set up years ago for a side gig that never panned out. Formaldehyde, arsenic powder, borax, stuff Tom would recognize, stuff that could be traced back to their world. I started small, testing my skills. The fox in the basement became my guinea pig. I'd never been as good as Tom, but I remembered enough how to skin, how to treat, how to pose. I worked late, after Sarah was asleep, the chemical stink masked by the hum of the old ventilation fan. My hands shook at first, but they steadied with purpose. This wasn't just practice, it was a rehearsal. I'd make something for them. A gift so perfect they'd never suspect until it was too late. By the end of the week, the fox looked better than before. Its fur glossier, its stance prouder. I smiled for the first time in days. I was ready to build something bigger. Timing was everything. I couldn't rush this. Sarah and Tom had to feel safe, smug even, in their little bubble. I kept up the act. Dinners together, small talk about her day, a laugh at her bad jokes. She'd relax, thinking I was clueless, and I'd watch her leave for work or drinks, knowing she was headed to him. Meanwhile, I built my trap. The shed gave me an idea. They loved showing off their work, documenting it. I'd give them a project too good to resist, something that'd draw them in deep. I decided on a wolf. Rare, striking, the kind of piece they'd drool over. I found a supplier online, a guy in Montana who dealt in legally sourced pelts, roadkill mostly, cleaned up for hobbyists like me. Cost a chunk of my savings, but money didn't matter now. The pelt arrived a week later, thick and gray. It sent earthy even after treatment. I hid it in the basement, locked in a trunk Sarah never checked. Then I planted the bait. I left a fake email on my laptop, opened one morning while she made coffee. An offer from a collector looking for a custom wolf mount, willing to pay big. I knew she'd see it. She always snooped when she thought I wasn't looking. Sure enough, that night she asked about it, casual as anything. "You still into that old hobby, Mark? Saw something about a wolf on your screen." I shrugged, played it off. "Just a random email. Guys offering cash. But I don't have the time or the skill anymore." Her eyes lit up, just a flicker, but I caught it. She didn't push, but I knew the seed was planted. She'd tell Tom and they'd jump at it, either to one-up me or to cash in themselves. I waited 2 days, then drove by the shed. Their cars were there, lights on late. I didn't need to see inside. I knew they'd taken the bait. While they schemed, I worked. The wolf wasn't just a mount. It was a weapon. I hollowed out the torso, careful to keep the fur flawless, and rigged it with a compartment. Inside, I packed a mix of chemicals, formaldehyde laced with something nastier, a slow-release compound I'd found in an old taxidermy forum. Nothing lethal, not yet. Just enough to sicken, to linger, to make them question their hands and their air. I sealed it tight, added a tiny valve hidden under the tail, something I could trigger later. The wolf looked pristine, a masterpiece even Tom would envy. I wrapped it in a tarp and waited for the right moment. Friday night, I staged the drop. I left a note in the basement, scrawled in a shaky hand like some strangers. "Wolf's ready. Unit 17, midnight. Payment on delivery." I made sure Sarah saw me hide it under a stack of papers. Knowing she'd check the second I left the room. I went to bed early, feigning a headache, and listened as she slipped out an hour later. I followed at a distance, saw her meet Tom at the shed. They hauled the tarp inside, their voices excited through the thin walls. I didn't stay, didn't need to. The trap was set. They'd open it, admire it, maybe even start working on it. And then they'd breathe it in. The next morning, Sarah looked off, pale, a little shaky, blaming it on a late night. "Client stuff," she muttered, pouring coffee with unsteady hands. I nodded, hid my satisfaction behind the newspaper. Tom called later, canceling our usual Sunday beer run. Said he wasn't feeling great either. I pictured them in that shed, hunched over the wolf, the air turning sour around them. It wasn't enough yet, but it was a start. The compound would linger, irritate their lungs, their skin, make them uneasy without knowing why. I'd let it simmer, let them tie themselves in knots before the real blow. I spent the day refining the next step. The wolf was phase 1, disruption, discomfort. Phase 2 was exposure. They loved their photos, their trophies, proof of their cleverness. I'd used that. I'd been collecting evidence, the notebook, the Polaroids, receipts from their supply runs. I scanned it all, built a timeline, a story too tight to deny. But I didn't stop there. I hacked Tom's old blog, some relic from his taxidermy days, still active with a weak password, and uploaded the photos, backdated them like they'd been there for months. Then I sent an anonymous tip to a local art forum they both followed. "Check out Grayson's latest, wild stuff in Willow Creek." By Monday, whispers started. A coworker asked if I'd seen Tom's creepy side hustle online. I played dumb, watched the ripple spread. Sarah came home rattled. Said someone at work mentioned weird pictures floating around. Tom texted her. I saw it on her phone when she left it unlocked. Panicked about his blog being hacked. They'd scramble, argue, point fingers. I'd made it public. Their dirty little secrets splashed where neighbors, friends, her boss could see. Shame was a slow blade, and I wielded it well. But I wasn't done. The wolf's valve was still unopened, the worst stuff waiting. I'd save that for later, when they thought they'd weathered the storm. For now, I let them stew in their unraveling world, knowing I'd only just begun. The fallout from the blog hit them harder than I'd expected. By Wednesday, Sarah was a mess. snapping at me over burnt toast, pacing the kitchen with her phone glued to her hand. Tom stopped by once, his face drawn, claiming he needed to borrow a tool from the garage. I let him rummage, watched him fumble through excuses about his blog being messed with. He didn't look me in the eye, and I didn't push, just smiled, handed him a wrench, and let him sweat. The forum post had done its job. People were talking. A neighbor asked me at the mailbox if Sarah was into that dead animal stuff now. Her nose wrinkled like she'd smelled something foul. I shrugged, said I didn't keep up with her hobbies, and let the rumor mill churn. Sarah tried to cover it. She told me over dinner that someone had stolen their photos, that it was a misunderstanding. Her voice cracked, and I nodded like I believed her, cutting my steak with slow, deliberate slices. She didn't know I'd seen the texts. Tom begging her to fix this, her promising to handle Mark. Handle me? That almost made me laugh. They were flailing, tangled in the web I'd spun, and I hadn't even pulled the tightest thread yet. The wolves sat in their shed, a ticking clock they didn't hear. I checked it Tuesday night, creeping in while they slept off their panic. The valve was untouched, the compartment still sealed. Good. I wanted them frayed before I turned it up. I kept busy, layering the next phase. Shame was a start, but I needed them broken. Psychologically first, then worse. I remembered a story Tom told me years ago, back when we were kids swapping tales over campfires. He'd said his biggest fear was losing control, being trapped in something he couldn't fix. Sarah's was simpler. She hated being seen as weak, a failure. I'd use both. I started small, planting doubts. I left fake voicemails on the house phone from a client canceling a big project, mentioning reputation issues with her firm. She'd hear them, assume her boss was getting wind of the photos. For Tom, I mailed him an envelope, no return address, stuffed with blurry shots of the shed. A note scrawled in block letters, "I know what you do." Let him think someone else was watching. It worked. Thursday, Sarah came home late, her eyes red, muttering about a rough day. Tom called her that night. I listened through the wall as she hissed into the phone. "We need to stop. It's too much," he argued, his voice tinny but desperate. They were cracking, turning on each other, just as I'd hoped. I slept soundly that night, dreaming of the wolf's glass eyes staring them down. Friday, I upped the ante. I borrowed a burner phone from a kid at school, paid him $20, no questions, and texted them both, "Check the shed." Midnight. I didn't sign it. They'd go, I knew they would. Too paranoid to ignore it. I got there first, hid in the shadows across the lot. They arrived separately, Sarah's car screeching in, Tom's truck lumbering behind. They argued outside the unit, voices sharp, her blaming him for the blog, him snapping that she'd been careless. I slipped closer, silent, and triggered the wolf's valve with a remote I'd rigged. An old garage door opener, rewired for range. A faint hiss leaked into the air, the nastier chemicals seeping out. They wouldn't notice at first, not over their shouting. I watched them stomp inside, then drove home, the night cold and crisp around me. They'd breathe it in soon enough. Hours of it, slow and steady, until their throats burned and their hands shook worse than ever. Saturday morning, Sarah didn't get out of bed until noon. She shuffled into the kitchen, pale as chalk, coughing into her sleeve. "Caught something?" she rasped, pouring tea with hands that trembled like leaves in a storm. I offered her soup, kept my voice soft, but inside I was humming. Tom didn't call, didn't show, just texted her once, a curt, "I'm out today," that I saw when she left her phone on the counter. I pictured him holed up in his house, hacking into a pillow, wondering why his lungs felt like sandpaper. The compound wasn't fatal, not yet. Just a cruel mimic of sickness, enough to make them miserable, to make them doubt their bodies and their minds. I checked the shed that afternoon while Sarah napped. The wolf sat where they'd left it, mid-display now, its fur fluffed like they'd been preening it before the air turned bad. The valve was still open, a faint haze lingering in the corners. They'd spent hours in there arguing, breathing it in. I shut it off, didn't want it too strong yet, and left a new note on their workbench. "You can't hide this." I scattered a few feathers around it, a touch of theater to keep them guessing. They'd think it was a stalker, a rival, anything but me. That was the beauty of it. I was invisible, the husband they'd dismissed. The sickness gave me cover to push harder. I started rumors at school, casual drops in the teacher's lounge about Tom Grayson's weird projects, and how Sarah might be mixed up in it. Word spread fast. Willow Creek's a small pond, and gossip's the ripple that never stops. By Monday, a colleague asked if I'd heard about some taxidermy scandal tied to my wife. I feigned shock, said I'd talk to her, and let the story grow legs. Sarah's firm called her in that afternoon. She came back quiet, said they'd asked about personal conduct. Tom's boss at the hardware store, he'd taken a part-time gig there, left a voicemail I accidentally played on speaker, questioning his side activities. Their worlds were shrinking, and I was the one closing the walls. I wasn't satisfied. Misery was good, but I wanted terror. I remembered a trick from a history lesson. Medieval torturers breaking men with sound, relentless and unseen. I bought a cheap speaker online, small enough to hide, and rigged it with a loop of noises. Low growls, scratches, a distorted voice whispering, "You took it all." Tuesday night, I planted it in Tom's garage, tucked behind a shelf. It had run on a timer, starting at 2 a.m., loud enough to wake him but soft enough to seem like a nightmare bleeding into reality. For Sarah, I left it in the basement, synced to the same hour. She'd hear it through the vents, blame the house, the stress, anything but me. Wednesday, they were wrecks. Sarah jumped at shadows, swore she heard something downstairs all night. Tom showed up unannounced, wild-eyed, asking if I'd heard anything odd lately. I said no, offered him coffee, watched him spill it down his shirt as his hands shook. They were unraveling, sick, scared, cornered, and I hadn't even touched them yet. The wolf waited, a silent sentinel for the final act. I'd let them think they'd hit bottom, then show them how deep it could go. By Thursday, they were shadows of themselves. Sarah barely ate, her cough a constant rasp, her excuses thinner than the winter light. Tom stopped texting, his silence louder than his panic had been. I kept the pressure on, subtle but relentless. I mailed Sarah a package, no return address, filled with printouts of their forum posts, their photos, circled in red with liar scrawled across her face. She opened it at the table, gasped, and shoved it under a newspaper before I noticed. Tom got one too. I made sure. Shots of the shed, his tools, a note. "Everyone sees you now." I watched from my car as he tore it open on his porch, his head whipping around like he expected me in the bushes. The speaker trick worked better than I'd dreamed. Sarah woke me at 3 a.m., frantic, swearing she heard voices in the walls. I played the concerned husband, checked the basement, found nothing, told her it was stress. She bought it, but her eyes were hollow, her grip on my arm too tight. Tom called her later, his voice a wreck through the phone. I listened from the hall, saying he couldn't sleep, that something's in the house. They were paranoid, jumping at phantoms I'd conjured, and I fed it. I left a dead bird on Tom's doorstep, its wings splayed like one of their mounts, and scratched next into the wood with a nail. Sarah found a feather on her car hood. No note, just enough to twist the knife. I escalated the wolf that night. I drove to the shed, opened the valve wider, let the full dose leak out. A thicker mix, acrid and slow. I'd added a dye to the compound, invisible until it hit skin, then a faint purple stain that'd bloom over days. They'd go back. They always did. It was their refuge, their pride, and they'd carry it with them. Friday, Sarah came home early, her hands scrubbed raw, a purple tint creeping up her wrists she didn't mention. Tom showed up at dusk, his neck mottled with the same shade, his voice hoarse as he asked if we'd seen anything strange. I said no, kept my face blank, and sent him off with a pat on the back. Their ruin was close now. The town buzzed. Sarah's firm put her on leave. Tom's job reassessed his hours. Neighbors stared, whispered. I turned their passion into a curse, their bond into a noose. But I wasn't done. The wolf had one last gift. A hidden audio chip, buried in its chest, set to trigger when they moved it. It'd play their own voices, snippets I'd recorded from stolen voicemails. Sarah laughing, Tom praising her steady hands. They'd hear it soon, realize how deep I'd burrowed, and know there was no escape. I'd built their cage from their own lives, and I'd lock it tight. Friday night, I could feel the air shifting, heavy with the weight of what I'd done and what was still to come. Sarah barely spoke, her hands, stained that faint purple, hid under long sleeves as she pushed food around her plate. She'd stopped making excuses, stopped pretending. I saw the fear in her now, not just exhaustion. A wild, cornered look that made her flinch when the phone rang. Tom hadn't been back since his frantic visit, but I knew he was crumbling too. I'd driven by his place earlier, seen the curtains drawn, his truck unmoved for days. They were sinking, and I was the tide pulling them under. I checked the shed after midnight, the darkness my ally now. The wolf stood proud, its fur catching the faint glow of a street lamp through the window. The air stank, thick with that acrid bite I'd unleashed. The dye had spread, smudges on the workbench, a streak on a jar. Proof they'd been back, touching it, breathing it. The audio chip was still silent, waiting for its moment. I'd rigged it to a motion sensor, delicate enough to catch them lifting it for a closer look. I left another gift. A photo of them from the shed's corkboard, their faces scratched out, pinned to the wolf's flank with a taxidermy needle. Let them find it, let it claw at their nerves. Saturday morning, Sarah cracked. She came downstairs, her hair a tangle, her voice sharp. "We need to talk, Mark." I set my coffee down, kept my face neutral. She paced, words spilling out. About the photos, the harassment. How she thought someone was after us. That word hit me like a stone. She didn't confess, didn't mention Tom, just rambled about stress and mistakes. I listened, nodded, let her think I was still the oblivious husband. "Maybe we should leave town," she said finally, her eyes pleading. I almost laughed. Leave? No, they'd stay right here in the trap I'd built. Tom called her an hour later. I caught the tail end through the wall, his voice ragged, begging her to check the shed again. She left soon after, claiming a grocery run. I followed at a distance, saw her meet him there. They stayed inside 20 minutes, long enough for the chip to wake. I pictured it. Their own voices echoing, Sarah's giggle, Tom's praise, looping in that stinking air, the photo staring them down. When she came home, she was white as bone, her hands shaking so bad she dropped her keys. "Something's wrong," she whispered, more to herself than me. I offered tea, watched her sip it, and said nothing. The dye was spreading, purple creeping up her arms, a faint ring around Tom's eyes when I glimpsed him later at the gas station. They couldn't wash it off. It was in their skin now, a mark no one else would understand but them. The town kept whispering. Sarah's leave became suspension. Tom's job cut him loose. I fed the fire, dropping hints to a nosy cashier about strange smells from his place. By Sunday, they were pariahs, and I was the quiet husband everyone pitied. Perfect. Sunday night, I turned the screw tighter. They were fragile now, sick, scared, isolated, and I wanted them to feel the walls closing in. I'd saved the worst of the wolf for this. The compartment held a second mix, a powder I'd ground myself, itching spores from a plant I'd sourced online, blended with the last of the chemicals. Harmless in small doses, but relentless up close. It'd cling to their clothes, their hair, make every moment a torment. I drove to the shed at dusk, the sky bruising purple like their skin. They weren't there. Too broken to work, I guessed. But the wolf was, its eyes glinting. I opened the valve fully, let the powder drift out, a faint cloud settling over their tools, their space. They'd come back eventually. They always did. I added a new layer, letters, forged in their hands. I'd practiced for days, mimicking Sarah's neat curls, Tom's jagged scrawl. Hers went to Tom. "I can't do this anymore, you're ruining us." His to her. "You dragged me into this. It's your fault." I mailed them Monday morning. No return address, postmarked from a town an hour away. They'd get them Tuesday, read them, doubt each other more. I wanted their bond shattered, their trust a pile of ash. The speakers kept humming, growls and whispers waking them nightly, and I saw the toll. Sarah's eyes were sunken, her cough sharper. Tom's truck sat crooked in his drive, like he'd forgotten how to park. Tuesday, I watched it unravel. Sarah stormed out mid-morning, drove to Tom's, pounded on his door. He opened it, and they shouted, her accusing him of writing that garbage. Him yelling she'd lost it. I stayed across the street, hidden in my car, and savored it. The letters had landed, splitting them wide open. She left in tears, he slammed the door, and I knew the spores were waiting. She'd gone to the shed first. I'd seen her car there earlier, tracked that powder home. By evening, she was scratching at her arms, muttering about bugs. Tom called hoarse, saying he felt crawling too. They didn't connect it yet, but they would. I kept the pressure on. I leaked a tip to the local paper, an anonymous source claiming odd activities at Unit 17. Wednesday, a reporter snooped around, took photos. Sarah saw it online, panicked, begged me to do something. I promised to look into it, my voice calm while my mind raced ahead. The powder, the dye, the voices. It was all building to a breaking point. I'd let them think they could run, then slam the door shut. The wolf was my masterpiece, but it needed an audience. I started planning the final reveal, something public, something they'd never outlive. Thursday, they hit their limit. Sarah barely left her room, coughing, scratching, her skin a patchwork of purple and red welts. She'd stopped hiding it, stopped caring I'd see. Tom was worse. I drove by and saw him on his porch, head in his hands, his neck a bruised mess. The spores had rooted deep, the dye a permanent brand. The paper ran a small piece vague, but damning, local storage unit tied to strange crafts. Neighbors gawked, kids pointed. Their world was a ruin, and I'd barely lifted a finger they could trace. I set the final bait that night. I left a note in the basement, where Sarah'd find it. Meet me at the shed midnight. End this. I signed it T. Let her think Tom was calling her back. I sent him 1-2 in her hand. Midnight, Unit 17. We fix it together. They'd go, too desperate to question it, and I'd be there ready. I loaded the wolf into my trunk, careful not to breathe the air around it, and drove early. I hid it inside, propped against their workbench, the chip rewired to play on a loop when they arrived. I added a spotlight, battery-powered, harsh, aimed at its face and scattered their photos around it like a shrine. The shed would be their stage. Midnight came, and so did they. Sarah first, her car rattling in, then Tom, stumbling from his truck. They froze at the door, the light catching the wolf's eyes. The chip kicked on, her laugh, his voice, over and over, while the powder hung thick in the air. Sarah screamed. Tom staggered back, clawing at his face. I watched from the shadows, my phone recording every second. They saw the photos, the needle-pin note I'd left. You built this. Sarah sank to her knees, sobbing. Tom swung at the wolf, toppling it, the powder bursting out in a cloud. They choked, scrambled, but there was no out. I uploaded the video Friday morning, anonymous, untraceable, to every local forum, every group they knew. By noon, it was everywhere. Their collapse, their shame, their ruined hands clawing at nothing. Sarah locked herself in our room. Tom vanished. Neighbors said he'd fled town. I sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee, the house quiet for the first time in weeks. The wolf was back in my basement now, a trophy of my own. They'd live but not whole. I'd carved them hollow, and I felt no remorse, just the cold, steady pulse of a job well done. Friday afternoon, the house was a tomb. Sarah hadn't come out of our room since the video hit. Her sobs had faded to silence, replaced by the occasional creak of the bed as she shifted. I didn't check on her. She'd made her choices, and I'd made mine. The phone rang twice, her sister, then her boss, but I let it go to voicemail, the messages piling up like leaves on a neglected lawn. Outside, Willow Creek buzzed with the fallout. I walked to the corner store for milk, caught the stares, the hushed voices. That video? A cashier muttered to her friend. Those two looked possessed. I paid in cash, kept my head down, and let them build the myth. Tom was gone, his house dark, his truck missing. A neighbor said he'd peeled out at dawn. Bags in the back. No word on where. I didn't care. He could run to the edge of the earth, and it wouldn't erase the purple on his skin or the rasp in his lungs. The video was viral now, shared beyond our town, forums, social media, even a blurry clip on a late-night news segment about bizarre small-town scandals. Their faces were everywhere, frozen in that shed, clawing at the air, the wolf looming over them. I'd stripped them bare, and the world was their judge. Back home, I cleaned the basement. The wolf sat on my workbench, its fur matted from Tom's swing, but still intact. I brushed it down, polished its eyes, made it pristine again. It wasn't just a tool anymore. It was proof, a monument to what I'd pulled off. I locked the trunk, hid the key, and scrubbed the chemical stink from the air with bleach. Sarah wouldn't go down there again. She hadn't in weeks, and if she did, she'd find nothing but dust and old boxes. The evidence was mine now, tucked away like a historian's archive. Every photo, every note, every receipt cataloged in a safe under the floorboards. Night fell, and I cooked dinner, spaghetti, her favorite, though I knew she wouldn't eat. I left a plate outside her door, knocked once, and retreated to the living room. The TV flickered with some mindless game show, but my mind was on the next step. They were broken, yes, but alive. That nagged at me. Not because I wanted them gone, but because they still had voices, memories, the chance to spin their story. Couldn't have that. History's written by the victors, and I intended to keep the pen. I spent the evening drafting letters, anonymous, of course, to their families, their co-workers, their old friends. Each one told the tale. Sarah and Tom, sneaking around, building their grotesque little empire, caught in their own filth. I included stills from the video, grainy but unmistakable, and mailed them from a box 3 towns over. Let their shame spread. Let it choke off any sympathy they might scrape together. By midnight, I was done, the envelope sealed, my hand steady. I slept better than I had in months, the wolf's glass eyes watching over me in my dreams. Saturday broke cold and gray, matching the mood seeping through the house. Sarah emerged at noon, a ghost in a bathrobe, her hair a snarl, her hands still faintly purple despite the scrubbing I knew she'd tried. She didn't look at me, just shuffled to the kettle, her movements slow, like she was dragging chains. "I'm leaving," she said finally, her voice flat. "Tomorrow. My sister's place." I nodded, sipped my coffee, didn't ask questions. She wouldn't fight me, wouldn't confess. She was too hollowed out for that. I'd taken everything she'd built, and she knew it. The mail came an hour later. Her sister's letter was first. She tore it open, skimmed it, and froze. I saw the photo flutter to the floor, her face scratched out in red ink, my words staring back. "She lied to you too." Sarah sank into a chair, her breath hitching, but no tears came. She was dry, spent. I left her there, went to the garage, and tinkered with an old clock I'd never fixed. A pointless task, but it kept my hands busy while my mind worked. Tom's family got their letters too, I was sure. His parents, his ex-wife, all reading about the man he'd become, the ruin he'd chased with my wife. I checked online. The video had hit 1 million views, comments piling up. Disgusting? What kind of people? They deserve worse. I didn't post, didn't engage. Just watched the tide I'd unleashed swallow them whole. Sarah's firm emailed her. A formal termination notice I glimpsed on her laptop when she left it open. Tom's landlord called our landline by mistake, asking if I knew where he'd gone. Rent unpaid, house abandoned. They were erased from Willow Creek, their lives scattered like ash, and I'd barely left my chair. That night I cooked again, steak, rare, a victory meal for myself. Sarah stayed upstairs, packing, I assumed. I ate alone, the silence thick but satisfying. The wolf stayed in my thoughts, a partner in this now. I'd keep it, maybe mount it somewhere new. A cabin, a fresh start once she was gone. I didn't need her anymore. Didn't need this house or its ghosts. Revenge had cleansed me, sharpened me. I'd sell it all, move north. Somewhere quiet where no one knew the name Mark or Sarah or Tom. The letters would follow them, though wherever they ran, someone would know. Before bed, I left one last gift. A small box on her pillow. Inside, a single feather from the shed, tied with a ribbon. No note, no explanation. She'd understand. I heard her gasp through the door, a muffled sound like a wounded animal, and smiled. She'd carry that feather in her mind forever. A splinter she couldn't pull out. I slept deep, dreamless. The weight of 20 years lifted by my own hands. Sunday morning, Sarah was gone. No goodbye, no scene. Just an empty closet, a missing suitcase, and a cold spot where her car used to sit. The house felt lighter, like it had exhaled a poison I'd been breathing too long. I found the feather on the kitchen counter, ribbon untied. She'd taken the hint but left it behind, a final surrender. I tossed it in the trash, brewed coffee, and sat in the quiet, letting the stillness settle. The war was over and I'd won. Tom surfaced later that day, a grainy photo on a friend's social media. Him at a gas station 2 states over, his face gaunt, his hands still stained. He'd run, but not far enough. My letters had reached his ex-wife. She'd posted a rant online, calling him trash and sick. The video linked for proof. His parents hadn't answered, but I knew they'd seen it. He was a pariah now, a shadow limping through a life I'd torched. Sarah's sister took her in, I heard through a mutual friend, but the welcome wouldn't last. The letter would fester, and Sarah's lies would unravel there too. I spent the day dismantling our life. I boxed her leftover things, clothes, books, a photo of us from better days, and dropped them at a thrift store, no note, no trace. The house went on the market Monday, sold by week's end, cash offer. No questions. A couple who didn't care about whispers. I kept the wolf, shipped it to a rental cabin I'd found upstate, a place with pine trees and no neighbors. The safe came with me, my archive of their ruin locked tight. I'd open it sometimes, I figured, to remember what I was capable of. Willow Creek forgot them fast. New scandals took root, and I faded into the background, the quiet teacher who'd lost his wife to some weird mess. No one suspected, no one asked. I left town a month later, the cabin waiting, the wolf mounted above the fireplace. It stared down at me as I unpacked, its eyes a mirror to my own. Cold, clear, unblinking. Sarah and Tom would live, scarred and scattered. Their names poison wherever they went. I'd taken their world, their trust, their pride, and turned it to dust. History would remember them as I'd written them, and that was enough. I poured a whiskey, toasted the wolf, and let the silence claim me.